Hi, everyone. This is Doug. This is going to be an episode, part 3 of our Was Paul a Roman Agent? But it's a little bit of a digression, but not an unimportant one about the research and whether Paul is a Roman agent. Even AI is going to cover up something. So this title is AI, Artificial Intelligence, Research Can Result in Contradictory and Ridiculous Pauline Biased Answers. And the example will be, if you ask the question, does Josephus mention Solus in Josephus' works? What would you expect is the answer if you know Josephus, you've read any of it? Let's just take a look real quick. So here's a discussion in Antiquities by Josephus, chapter 20.9.4, and that was written in approximately the 90s AD. And he's just going to mention, by the way, just look at the names that you'll see in the New Testament in the book of Acts, Gamaliel. And okay, so then we get down to Costabrus. Okay, so let's just back up a little bit so we can read the context. And the context is not important here. It's just the fact that these names are in the writings of Josephus. The name Solus in particular is what I'm trying to highlight, that you see the AI is going to get this wrong. And I want to find out why. Ananias was too hard for the rest by his riches, which enabled him to gain those that were most ready to receive. Costabrus also and Solus did themselves get together a multitude of wicked wretches, and this because they were of the royal family, meaning Costabrus and Solus, who are both brothers elsewhere mentioned, they were of the royal family. They belonged to the Herodian family. And so they obtained favor among them because of their kindred to Agrippa. Again, mentioning the royal family. This is one of the sons of the family of Herod. Okay, so is the answer to AI that Solus doesn't even exist in the book of Josephus's works? The answer is that's impossible. It's right there. You can see it with your own face, your own eyes. Excuse me. All right. Now here's another example. This is again Josephus writing, but this is earlier in the 70s. He's talking about the War of the Jews, which ended in the siege and destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. And he says it's in book 2.17.4. I'm just going to read this entirely, and again, out of context, because I'm not trying to prove what the context is about. I'm trying to say, here's Saul's name again, right? And we're going to see how it's connected again to Agrippa and the Costabrus again. So the men of power, perceiving that the sedition was too hard for them to subdue, and that the danger which would arise from the Romans would come upon them first of all, endeavored to save themselves, and sent ambassadors, some to Florus, the chief of which was Simon, the son of Ananias, and others to Agrippa, among whom the most eminent were Saul and Antipas and Costabrus. So sending people to Agrippa, and then was to send them to a group which the most eminent of the Agrippa party were 3 people: Saul, Antipas, and Costabrus. And let's not ignore the fact that Acts 13:1, in similar conjunction, Luke says that Manaen was brought up, childhood friend of Herod the Tetrarch, which is the name of Antipas. Herod Antipas and Herod the Tetrarch are the same person. And Saul. So they're just in the different order. Antipas in Acts 13:1 comes first, but Saul comes next. See the direct link. And then Costabrus is mentioned elsewhere to be a brother of Saul, and both of them are supposed to be a part of the Herodian family. That's stated specifically about these two, Costabrus and Saul, who were the king's kindred, and it says it again here, the kindred of the Herodian king. And they mean by that likely Agrippa and or Antipas, who was also king. So the Herod Antipas was the Tetrarch, meaning one of the 4 rulers of Judea, and his control was primarily Galilee. Okay, all right, and that's all you need to know. That clearly, whatever the AI answer is, it has to say Saul or Saulus is mentioned here, and if it doesn't say that, it acts like it doesn't know it's in the book of the Antiquities, or in the book of Antiquities, or in the War of the Jews. So let's take a look. Here I'm going to show you the AI question, and the AI answer is here in the black. Okay, yellow is AI question, black are the answers. They're totally contradictory with one another. Where in Josephus' Antiquities does it say Saul is a kinsman or relative of Agrippa? In Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus refers to Saul as a kinsman of Agrippa in his discussion of the Herodian brothers Saul and Costabar. I just showed it to you, right? So this is the correct answer. We can see that unequivocally. You just saw the proof. Then this other person asked the question a different way. How many times does Josephus in all his works mention Saulus? Josephus does not mention Saulus, the Hebrew name for Paul, in any of his known works, meaning he mentions Solus 0 times. There is no recorded instance of Josephus referring to Paul by his name in his writings. But the clearly false statement is he mentions Solus 0 times. We just showed you twice he mentioned him that way. So AI answers contradict themselves, and this is proof of either a Pauline filter, basically to give you false information that would mislead you from knowing the truth, or there's simply somebody who cited, and this little link here is to tell you you need to go look at there's a source for this statement, okay? But we're going to see the source does not agree with even this categorization, so something is really fundamentally wrong here. Let's continue. So this is a false statement, and that was a true statement. Okay, let's continue. Now, how did this come about? So let me discuss this now. All right, so a gentleman wrote me, a good guy, but I'm just answering him bluntly that what he responded to, or his question to me, showed maybe he didn't do good research. So I was just going to ask him about that. He says he looked at the video and he said 3 minutes into the video I did on Was Paul a Roman Agent Part 2, in the citation for, quote, Solus, a relative of Agrippa, seems wrong. I cannot find it in Josephus Antiquated. Maybe Jewish War? And the answer is, I suggest in the future you simply ask AI, as I did, to respond to you. Where in Josephus' Antiquities does it say Saul is a kinsman or relative of Agrippa? Guess what the answer is. In Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus refers to Saul as a kinsman of Agrippa too in his discussion of the Herodian brothers, Saul and Kostovar. And I just showed you what that was. So he said it wasn't there, and he didn't tell me whether he used AI or not. But his answer is he's going to tell me it was in his AI, the answer to an AI question, artificial intelligence question. And it told him it wasn't there. And I'm like, okay, so I decided I'm going to test what he said. Let me do an AI question exactly like he said. And he was right. It says Solus is never mentioned. Remember, let's go back. Let me show you. Solus, it does say the Hebrew name of Paul, but it's still the word Solus. Does that appear? It does not mention Solus in any of his known works, meaning he mentions Solus 0 times. And it's false, right? Where do we get this from? You're going to be amazed when I show you what it is. Then he responds, and he's going to tell me, Doug, I got it from AI. I should have saved my transcript. AI said Josephus never mentioned Solus. So after I proved to myself he's correct, the AI gives a false answer, I wrote him back and apologized. Thank you for explaining what happened. You indeed took the right step and did the right AI search. I apologize. You are right. I just put in how many times does Josephus in all his works mention Solus, and it says 0. It says absurdly, but with Paulinist defensiveness, even in an AI answer, here it is. Josephus does not mention Solus, the Hebrew name for Paul, in any of his known works, etc., meaning he mentions Solus 0 times. I've already referred that to you and shown it to you. I looked at the source, and it does not support this, so that we're going to go through that right now. I'm going to show you the source that's cited never says the word Solus never appears. It just simply says the name Paul never appears, and that's not the same thing as Solus. So the answer had to be objective. AI is not supposed to be able to think about how can I protect Paul. But apparently there's some AI algorithm that's going in that direction, which I'll show you. Apparently it's true that there's some algorithm protecting Paul. I looked at the source and it doesn't support this. It is a scholar who solely says that Josephus does not mention Paul by name, a major distinction. So how do you get a scholar who says Paul's not mentioned by name and then conclude the Solus doesn't appear in Josephus? That's not the same thing. They're two different things. So you have to know that what the scholar said about Paul not being mentioned by Josephus is true. The word Paul never appears referring to the person we know as Paul, but Solus does match up with Paul in the lifetime of him, and it fits Acts 13:1 and so on. Let me just finish off what I wrote him. Is AI capable of Pauline bias? That's a good question. I think we need to ask. This is my first example of it, so I'm going to document it so that it's known whether it's Pauline bias or could a crazy answer. And then really the answer that Solus has never mentioned here is from an completely unfounded book. But there's a book that's the guy says Paul was never mentioned. But to do that as a scholar, you have to know his full name and or names that he's used in the past. And he was always known as Saul up to Acts 13:1. He lived his life always known as Saul or Solus if you were in a Latin community his entire life until sometime in the period of after Acts 13, verse 1. I'm going to do a series entitled AI Searches, Pauline Biases, Even in the AI Answer, unsupported in the link. Sorry I came down on you, but I assumed anyone could do an AI search and easily knows Josephus mentions Solus numerous times. Please look for my public apology to you, but also thanks to you, we know that AI answers are not gospel. And that's why I'm doing this video. So we learn you can't trust them entirely. They're good starting points. I'm going to absolutely recommend you use AI searches for everything you do now. Don't just ask to type in words. Do an AI search. Get a pointed question in there, but don't trust the answer. Go research it still. And even sometimes you have to use common sense and say that's not true. All right, let's continue. Okay, now, so let's step back. Maybe you're new to Christianity and you don't know this, that Paul had two names. He starts as Saulus and he becomes Paulus later, okay? Or he uses the name Paulus. He had to have a Latin birth name, by the way, and his Latin birth name was Pauxilillus, according to Augustine in his interpretation of 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2. I've discussed that in other videos. So Paul had to have a Latin name. Saul, which comes from a Hebrew word, Shaul, could not have been his Latin name on his birth certificate. So basically he took his Hebrew name and he Latinized it. Okay, he turned it from Shaul into Saulus, so it would be easier for people to interpret he's a Roman person or a Latin speaker, so to speak. So to know if Paul is mentioned in Josephus, one must study both names Paul used. That's meaning Saulus for Latin people and Latin land. Judea is Latin land at that time, even though it's mostly Jewish speakers. Still, it's controlled by Rome, and the official language of the authorities is going to have to be Latin, and they may have to learn the local language, but it's still a Latin-speaking country. So using Saulus in the country of Judea, as Josephus is telling the story in the early pre-days that Paul wasn't a Christian yet, allegedly as a Christian, he is definitely using the name Saul or Saulus. Okay. Let me show you how we know about this a little bit. And again, AI questions, very good. They're a useful starting point 99% of the time, I would say, so far, in my experience. In the book of Acts, Luke refers to Paul as Saul primarily before Acts 13:9. So you have chapter after chapter from chapter 9 all the way up to 13, where repeatedly Luke only uses the reference of Saul to refer to who you now know as Paul. Where it is stated that Saul, who was also called Paul, see, right there, Luke is telling you it's the same person. Saul and Paul are the same person. They just use the same name, these two names. He uses these two names, marking the point where Luke begins consistently using the name Paul for the apostle throughout the rest of the book, meaning that Paul himself changed the name he wanted to be known by when he was among Christians, and no more did he want to have anyone remember that he was known as Saul beforehand and what he was doing and all the stuff. And then that makes sense if I just showed you how closely it is to the Herodian family, if anybody could connect the dots, and those dots point to Paul being a Roman agent. So let's continue. Acts 13:9. This is the verse where Luke first introduces the dual name Saul and Paul for the same person. Reason for the shift. Saul is considered a Jewish name, while Paul is the Roman equivalent, and Luke may have switched to Paul as Paul began his ministry primarily among the Gentiles. I don't believe that's right. I think Paul decided, I'm going to use my name, not Luke. I'm going to use my Latin name, Pauxilillus or Paulus for short, and I don't want to bring up or remind people what I used to be known as. But in Luke's position, he wants to bring up that Paul's actual original name was Saulus, or would be known by the Romans that way for good, very good reason. This is an appellate brief, and in order to get the Romans on his side to win the appeal, Luke Acts has to create some sympathy, and definitely if the listener or reader of the appeal briefs can connect the dots, that if Manaen is brought up with Herod the Tetrarch and Saul in Acts 13:1, what does that mean? He means he's part of the royal family of the people that you, Rome, you've appointed. And Nero and the people in charge who are going to hear this appeal will be sympathetic to Paul and not favoring the Jewish people or opposed to Paul, allegedly about him bringing Trophimus the Ephesian into the temple and allegedly left him alone, or maybe they thought he directed him to go into past the middle wall of separation and violate the temple of Trophimus, to violate the temple in uncircumcised state. So there was a reason why Paul changed the name, and it's not Luke making the decision. And I just hate when people suppose or make additions to things. The only person you know is using this name, it has the right to decide how he wants to be known at a certain point in time. He wanted to be known as Paul from that time forward. Why he did it could be for personal insulation from his past, so you wouldn't connect the dots. That's exactly probably why he did it. Now I want to show you how powerful AI can be to do a good thing for us, to be beneficial. So I put in the question, how many times prior to Acts 13:9 does Luke refer to Paul as Saul? How many times? What do you think? Prior to Acts 13:9, Luke refers to Paul as Saul 11 times in the book of Acts. So now let me say this. If you're an alleged Christian scholar and you conclude or tell people that Paul is never mentioned in Josephus, you really have to be incompetent if you say leave it there and you don't say, well, I have to go by, did he ever use the name Saul or Saulus in the did Josephus ever refer to a guy named Saul or Saulus? That's key. Okay, and I showed you actually, if you look at the two quotes, you could have looked it up either way, because if you look here, this is Saul in this version of the War of the Jews, and this one is Saulus in Antiquities. So you have a clear reference that any scholar worth his weight would have to be saying, I have to decide that Josephus didn't use either the word Paul or Saul or Saulus in order to rule out that Josephus is talking about Paul. And if the alleged scholar, or AI gives you a false answer that you know for a fact Josephus doesn't talk about Paul in the uh, Antiquities or in the War of the Jews, you have to have proof that Saulus is not not Paul, when it clearly looks like he is, because of what I just told you. Acts 13:1 is such a clear parallel there that you can't deny that Saulus and Herod the Tetrarch or Antipas are connected right next to each other in the same sentence in Josephus' Antiquities as it is in the same sentence of Acts 13:1. That's uncanny. But let's continue here. So I've already gone over this two passages here. So I want to show you next. Where did this absurdity that Paul is never mentioned in a scholarly way? Paul is never mentioned in any of Josephus's works. And as I said, a scholar has to be responsible and know that Paul has two names. So you have to say Paul wasn't mentioned, and I've included, obviously I have to include the name Saul or Saulus in my conclusion. So you're going to see what AI does. It's going to take a guy who says Josephus. Well, let's just go through it. This is the guy, Finding Paul's Biography in Josephus, interview with Felix Asiedu. And I'm going to show you his book in a minute. He is interviewed in 2021, and he says Josephus nowhere mentions Paul in his writings. This is the AI proof text. This is the link they give you for this conclusion. Josephus does not mention Saulus in any of his known works, meaning he mentions Saulus 0 times. This is the link here to this. This is the proof. Oh my gosh, wait till I show you how ignorant this particular writer is. I mean, completely ignorant that Paul's name was Saul earlier in life, Wait till you see that. So this is their proof. And this means that, could it be, if you're getting AI answers, you have to absolutely look at the links, because you may be getting people who are completely ignorant and unskilled and unlearned in their profession of being allegedly a scholar on Saul, Paul, or whatever. So you can be misled by virtue of somebody who's ignorant. And then what's problematical for me is, why did AI choose this person over the tons of other scholars, Eisenman included? Eisenman is like all over the place connecting Saul and Paul, but this is the person they're going to rely upon. Wait till you see the person they rely upon who is supposedly proves this. How knowledgeable is this guy? All right, so I decided to buy this book by Asiedu that he's being interviewed about, where he says Paul is not mentioned at all in the works of Josephus, which is, like I said, is on its face unlikely. Okay, it's likely that the conclusion of Eisenman and many other scholars is that reference to Saul or Saulus has to be Paul of Tarsus, that we know as Paul of Tarsus, because that was Paul's other name was Saul and Saulus, and that explains why Luke is even telling you in his early life he was known as Saul Saulus, but now in his post Acts 13:1 life, he's now going to be known as Paul. And I'm not going to get into all of it, but he's basically, he does try to say that Paul should have been known by Josephus, and he's kind of surprised that Josephus doesn't know him. And that really is the hallmark of something this man should have asked a deeper question. Am I asking the wrong question? maybe Josephus didn't know him as Paul. Maybe he knew him as Saulus, and that's what is a flaw in this whole book. That he says, I'm shocked that Josephus doesn't know Paul if he's such a major figure, but he doesn't have a good explanation for why Josephus doesn't know him if he's such an important figure. And the answer is obviously Josephus did know him. And you're going to see Josephus probably was on the same ship with Paul, but that's another remark. We'll talk about that at the end here. But we have a real, this guy is claiming to be scholarly, and he's just puzzled why Josephus never mentions Paul. But he does if you take those passages I just told you about. All right, so here's the article. I just want you to know if you want to find this, you can read it here, the title more correctly or easily there. And this is what he says in context a little bit more. This is not a minor event in the life of Josephus. The coincidence with Paul's visit the following year or so should be part of any discussion we have about what Josephus or his father and his contemporaries may have known about Paul. So Josephus and Paul are in Jerusalem at the same time. Paul got there a year earlier, and Josephus comes later. So he's pointing out, gosh, they're even in the same place at the same time. And then he says, am I speculating here? Wait, excuse me. The coincidence with Paul's visit the following year or so should be part of any discussion we have about what Josephus or his father and his contemporaries may have known about Paul, given that Josephus nowhere mentions Paul in his writings. Am I speculating here? No, it is Josephus himself who tells us in his autobiography that when he was 19 years old, he entered the public life in Jerusalem among the Pharisees. Josephus was born in 37 Christian era. He was 19 in 56 Christian era. That's about the time that Paul is arriving in Jerusalem and all those events start happening in Acts 21. We can surmise that Paul wrote his letter to the Romans around 57 Christian era from Corinth, maybe a little later, I would say, but that's approximate, and then headed for Jerusalem, and then he was arrested and subsequently sent to Caesarea and incarcerated for 2 years. What is most revealing is that Josephus is deliberately silent about the period between 56 and 63 Christian era. All right, so this author is trying to suggest by Josephus's silence, you can infer something is going on. It may just be he doesn't want to document the events of the riot where Saulus, who he knew him as Saulus, had caused, and now is a big issue that's going up on appeal, and so that's maybe why he's not bringing it up. He's on Paul's side because Josephus has a common friend, Epaphroditus, and we've gone through that in the last episode, who is going to publish his works, and Epaphroditus is a good buddy of Paul. Let's continue. I'm just going to move on. Let's take a look here. But I want to show you, here's this guy claiming to be a scholar. This is a guy claiming, I'm authoritatively telling you that Josephus never mentions Paul in the book. And that's all he said. And then the AI added that it means that Saul himself wasn't mentioned, or Saulus is never mentioned. And that's false. So AI has jumped to a conclusion that even this man doesn't say. But I want to show you something. For a man who's supposed to know something important, this man apparently doesn't even know Paul had a second name. I know that sounds crazy, but listen to this. The word Saulus, I did a search on it, not mentioned once. Well, we can show you again that Saulus appears in Antiquities chapter 20 in the traditional English translation. Now I'm going to ask you to look at here. Now here's a different translation, more modern, that changes Saulus into Saul in the book of the War of the Jews. Now I'm going to show you that this same gentleman doesn't seem to know that Paul is known as Saul at all, except through footnote references that the titles of books are calling Paul Saul, but he doesn't seem to know anything about it because he never mentions it himself in the body of his work. In the text, he never says that Paul was also known as Saul. He just simply has some footnotes to books that use that title of Saul of Tarsus, and he doesn't put two and two together that you need to look up the word Saul inside of Josephus or Saulus. Never. This is a man who seemingly is completely ignorant of the fact that Paul is also known as Saul. Let's take a look. All right, so I just showed you there's no reference to Saulus at all in his book from 2019. Let's look if he ever even mentions Saul, right? Well, how could you miss this one, my friends? He only mentions it 2 times, and he's only mentioning it because it's in the title of books. And then when you go to the bibliography, so I don't count them again, there's 2 references to the same book. So this book is a book called Saul of Tarsus. This is called the Apostolate and Apostasy of Saul. Just the titles of books have the word Saul in it. And then that creates 2 entries of it when he discusses the books initially, and they're in the bibliography, so I'm not going to count that. And the only other reference to Saul in its entire book is a reference to somebody else who's just, his name is Saul Oleon. This is it. He doesn't seem to know that Paul had a second name, my friends. And this is what AI is relying upon to tell you that Josephus never mentions the word solace at all. Zero times. Zero times. Emphasize zero times does Josephus talk about a guy named Solus in any of his works. Incredible. And I just want to show you the books. Here's the book title. Tony Costa, Is Saul of Tarsus Also Among the Prophets? Okay, and here's the book. It's an article inside this. And that's like, he's forced to say it, but he's like he doesn't know it. It's just true. Okay, so let's go to the next one. And then the next is Alan Siegel, Paul the Convert, the Apostasy of Saul. That's the second time he mentions it. And then the third time it's mentioned in his book is actually another book reference where it's only in the name of the person who's the author, Saul Olean. This shows you a complete ignorance of the fact of Paul changing or using a new name beginning right after Acts 13:1. So after doing all that work, I decided, let me look up who is this guy. F.B.A. Asiedu, historian, consultant, author of Paul and his letters, Thinking with Josephus, Paul and the Fate of Early Christianity, from Anselm to Augustine. So he's writing a lot of books, but he writes from avowed ignorance. I don't know of any reference to Paul in the book writings of Josephus. But how do we know if you have a good literate understanding of the book of Acts? Do you know where it says there's Saul is his name used 11 times and up to Acts 13:1, and then it switches to Paul? Did you not know this? Apparently he doesn't, ladies and gentlemen. Apparently he does not. He then writes a whole article called Josephus, Paul, and Early Christianity. Josephus is our best source for Jewish life around the time of Jesus. So why doesn't he often talk about Christians in Judea? He probably was, but you didn't know the name that you're looking at is Paul's name before he had his conversion. But it's still a Christian in Judea. We need to, someone who claims to be a Christian in Judea, we need to know his life story beforehand. Wouldn't that be important, sir? You don't know anything about it, apparently. Now listen to how he argues his case. I call this the ostrich in the sand argument. I am also suggesting that what he does has something to say about Paul and about how we should think about the early Christian movement. He's talking about Josephus, what he does within Jewish life in the first century. And I gesture in the end that Josephus wished to exclude the followers of Jesus as legitimate members of the first century Jewish society. So he's trying to say is, oh, the Christians aren't mentioned in the book of Josephus, or either book of Josephus, of the War of the Jews or the Antiquities, and that's just to marginalize Christians. No, my friend, he really doesn't know anything about Christianity. The book James, the head of the church, is mentioned in great detail as being killed and murdered by the high priest Ananias after he was demanded or requested by the Jewish people. They don't trust the high priests or Herodian appointees. They wanted someone holy that they respected. And even though James is the head of the Christian movement, they don't care. They want him to be the officiating officer at Yom Kippur in the temple. And Ananias was forced aside to let James, come in and do the officiating of the sacrifice at that time. And guess what? Ananias didn't like it very much and had James killed, and that's recorded in Josephus chapter under the. It's currently you'll see it'll be put under the year 62 A.D. That is basically modern dating efforts, and they'll put it as a heading. So what do you got? You got nothing, sir. You act like you didn't know this, and the honor and the respect that the Jewish people overall gave to James to give him this appointment, even if they were not followers of Jesus Christ, they all wanted him to do it. And then you see what happened. He gets killed and murdered. And then the real consensus of the Jewish people across the board was that when the 70 AD siege of Jerusalem came, this was the punishment for Ananias being killed on the temple steps. Excuse me, Ananias killing James on the temple steps brutally and in a horrible way. So, wow, we have, what is he doing? Head in the sands. I don't know about it. I don't see it. I don't read James. I'm going to make these observations about Josephus. I'm going to write a whole book with the name Josephus in the title. Josephus, Paul, and the Fate of Early Christianity. People are going to think I actually read it. But just let me tell you, if you're going to do a synopsis of Josephus on the Christian era, you got to read the whole section. And you got to know these things. And the Jesus is mentioned too. And even though some people thought it was a corruption, the Slavonic Josephus shows much earlier that it was there originally, whatever that passage was. It's not in controversy. But it's just simply still, or maybe it still could have been corrupted. I mean, it's in the 800s, 900s, but there is an earlier reference than later. As scholars were skeptical and trying to throw it out. But it doesn't matter. Whatever it is, we know that the reference to James is authentic because of the way it's from a Jewish perspective that Josephus even has, he's acknowledging that James had this honor and respect from everybody, and that people blamed the entire destruction of Jerusalem based on the criminal act of Antipas in killing James. And so really the real cause of the Roman war was Antipas' fault, the high priest, who was really a Herodian appointee, by the way. But so he's being blamed for everything. And that's a very desired thing for Josephus, to shift the blame off the Romans, who he now is patronizing, and take it and put it all on this high priest who's dead. And basically that's the explanation for the entire 1 million people being killed in the temple in 70 A.D. Anyway, so is ignorance a way of making decisions? That's apparently what is going on here, because that's the link. This is the guy who's telling us that Paul is not mentioned in Josephus, and then extrapolated by the AI to say it means even the word Saul doesn't even appear. And this guy didn't even know the name Saul, so he doesn't even go this far as AI. AI takes it one step further and says, well, if Paul is also known as Saul, and this man says Paul isn't mentioned inside of Josephus's works, then therefore, I'm being robotic deliberately, therefore Paul is never even discussed as Saul or Saulus in Josephus. That's the AI stupidity. So AI must be stupid too. It's really possible. Is that possible? Could it be that dumb? Maybe. So we have to be careful. In other words, I'm just saying this is a warning sign. Don't rely 100% on AI. It doesn't always work. Now, I just want to throw something out of you, because as I was doing the research, is there are people actually looked carefully at Josephus's crash. He was with 600 other people on a boat trying to get back to Rome from the port of Caesarea area, or that coastline. So he's taking the same trip that Paul takes, and he has a accident. Now that could just be a coincidence, right? Of course, people have accidents on the same trip, but it was the same details, the same locations, and so on. It's a very uncanny similarity. So here's a person who talks about that. So I just want to say is it's possible that Josephus actually knows Paul personally, and was a friend of his. And remember, Epaphroditus, the secretary of Nero, is the publisher of Josephus's works, and that begins in the 70s, and then basically the War of the Jews, and that means he knew Epaphroditus, also knew Paul. So Paul has something in common with Josephus. They have the common friend of Epaphroditus, the secretary of Nero. And this is what Rick Bonner says. The lives of Paul, Saul, and Josephus were very similar. They were both on the same prison ship going to see Emperor Nero in about AD 62. That's uncanny. So they were both shipwrecked on Malta, and both sailed on the next spring to Naples to see Nero, and both spent a couple of years in Rome. Their two lives mesh very well. And I asked AI, what about this? Yes, Josephus and Paul were both shipwrecked around the same time period. Okay, well, that's interesting. And then this was grayed out a little bit because I have to subscribe and pay money to see the full Quora message. But listen to this. Paul, Saul, and Josephus were army commanders in control of Galilee. I didn't know about that. That's a way of referring. Yes, I think you could conclude that Saul was an army commander, and I didn't know Josephus was in control of Galilee in the AD 60s. And both were chasing a powerful enemy called Jesus of Gamala. So he's trying to imply that that's really our Jesus, and it could be, depending on what the word Gamala is, around Galilee. And both of these Jesuses were commanders of a band of ruthless fishermen. A similar story. So anyway, I'm going to leave it there, but you can just see that there's some meat to be still researched on. Is there a connection between Paul and Josephus? And ultimately to Epaphroditus, which I mentioned in the last episode, is very strong. Now you'd have another reason to believe there's a very tight connection between Paul and Josephus, because Paul and Josephus were likely on the same ship, which, by the way, means that who was on the ship with the two of them? Luke. Luke is going to be on that ship. He's going to be recording all these facts, and he's going to be meeting Josephus for the first time in real terms. So that raises a lot of other interesting questions. Did Luke get some of his history from Josephus directly from the word of mouth? The War of the Jews was written in the 70s, and people always say, oh, the proof that Luke is in the 70s or later period is because Josephus is being borrowed, allegedly, by Luke when instead is Luke actually talked to the guy on that ship in 62 AD. He would learn from Josephus some of the facts and details that are later going to appear in the book of Acts that people say, well, that was gotten from Josephus's books. I'm going to say it was gotten from Josephus directly. So we're going to look at that angle one day in the future, but I'm just showing you this tentatively to say there's some interesting details I found while I was doing this. I thought I'd throw this out there just for consideration. Anyway, God bless everybody. I hope that reminds you, do not take AI to the bank. It's just a good starting point, and it's a very good way of researching. And I don't do any more research where I don't ask pointed questions. I ask AI questions, and I get very helpful answers, and gets me to my the key information I want to research and study, and get the books I really want to examine, and so on. So I suggest you do that too, but don't be fooled that you can just trust everything it says. All right, God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.